By the way, Maria hasn't fully left Puerto Rico. Devastating rains continue there right now, and much of the power outage that they've been complaining about could last for months. So many homes and businesses that are simply destroyed. And now that Maria is, making tracks for Turks and Caicos, the party just roars on here. The former Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Commerce, David Sampson. Secretary, thanks for joining us here. We forget that after a hurricane and its most lethal winds pass, it's not as if it goes away. Maria hasn't left Puerto Rico, and the region, of course, very familiar with the rains that continue. That tends to be the most damaging and damning part of these storms, huh?
Right. The floods that come with the hurricanes are very destructive. As we all know, Houston is primarily a flood event, not a wind event. I think Florida is going to be primarily a flood event as well, although there is some wind damage. But Puerto Rico is very hard hit. This is going to be a long-term recovery. They simply don't have the kind of infrastructure and capacity and resilience there that you see in Texas and Florida.
So what do we do?
Well, I think that there's going to be airlift of supplies in by American military airplanes and ships. There's going to be obviously federal money that is going to have to come back into Puerto Rico to help rebuild the very basic infrastructure that enables businesses to get back up and running. The problem is there's not going to be not nearly as much insurance presence in Puerto Rico as there is in Houston and Florida. Only about 50% of the homes in Puerto Rico have wind insurance at all, and a much smaller portion than that have flood insurance.
So, when we have something that could be certainly a record breaker for cumulative storms this year versus, I guess, the last big one a dozen years ago, how does the government prepare for that? I know FEMA technically can use emergency funds and the checks will be granted later and all of that. But this is a whole different case covering a much broader region. How is that handled?
Well, it's going to be handled through special appropriations. There's already been the first tranche of special appropriation for FEMA with regard to Houston and Florida, but that's only the down payment. There's going to have to be more later on. I think the bigger question, Neil, is what can we do long term to prepare or to bring in more private insurance into the equation and build resilience into these communities so that we lessen the impact when these storms hit. And that's something that's largely been left out of the public policy discussion for many years.
It certainly has, because even it's news to homeowners that discover they thought they had flood or related insurance, and then they discover higher deductibles than they thought, or that it wasn't covered to the degree they thought. How is that handled? Because I've gotten quite a few emails from people. I'm talking more in Florida and Texas than certainly Puerto Rico. But how is that communicated, or should that communication be improved, or is that typical of Americans? We don't really read the fine print.
It's an ongoing process of communication. More needs to be done. But yes, the real problem that we're seeing in Houston is an underinsurance problem. Only about 1 in 6 of the homes that were flooded have flood insurance.
Yeah, that amazes me.
We say all the time, flood is not covered under your normal homeowner's policy. You have to buy a separate flood insurance policy.
You'd think their mortgage lender would require that.
Well, if you have a federally insured mortgage, it is required. But there are many, many homes that are not under the federal housing insurance program or not in the 100-year floodplain that choose not to buy the flood insurance.
All right, Secretary, thank you very much. Didn't mean to jump on top of you there, sir.
Not at all.
David Sampson, the former Commerce Deputy Secretary.